Today's episode of the Unveil podcast is the second in my mini-series with Polyvagal Institute people. Michael Allison is today's guest, and Michael Allison has partnered with Polyvagal Institute and Stephen Porges in providing education and coaching of polyvagal theory in a variety of industries, fitness, wellness, business, etc., and is currently leading the development of a Polyvagal-Informed Certificate for health, wellness, and performance coaches accredited by the National Board for Health and Wellness Coaches. And if you've heard that paragraph, you know why I absolutely love Michael Allison, because I am a passionate believer in polyvagal-informed approaches, especially in functional medicine, health and wellness, and anybody purporting to support the wellness of other human beings. So, Michael is a bit of a unique human, however. His application of polyvagal theory to performance in his company, The Play Zone, provides a paradigm-shifting methodology to optimize control of our performance through skillful and conscious control of our physiology, and is endorsed by Polyvagal Institute and Dr. Porges. You will hear us discuss during this episode about how that happened. And Michael really just approached the Polyvagal Institute, and you will learn a lot about how accepting Dr. Stephen Porges is of other people's ideas and adaptations and applications of the polyvagal theory through this episode. Michael was a featured speaker at the Polyvagal Institute's annual summit in October 2022, where we met, and he will be presenting at the Innovative Education Summit at the Elms in Colwall, UK on the 11th and 12th of March 2023, and the Master Series at Oxford University, UK on the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of September 2023. I did not know this until I got his bio, and I may attempt to attend one of those when I'm back on home soil at some point during the coming year. Interestingly, and we do touch on this in today's podcast, Michael is currently launching the premier on-the-ground Polyvagal Wellness and Performance Center in Santa Barbara, California, to host live and live-streamed retreats, workshops, and conferences integrating a variety of polyvagal-informed industry experts to provide experiential training, lifestyle and certificate programs for coaches, therapists, leaders, educators, organizations, and the general public. You can tell I'm excited by bringing this guest to you because we discuss really practical things that you'll recognize in human physiology, in particular in athletes, where you can understand polyvagal theory a little bit deeper and from the perspective of how our nervous systems influence the way we are able to perform. And by perform, this doesn't just mean performing on a stage or on the athletic sporting field. It means performing in everyday life. It means just showing up. And so today I talk with Michael all about how to work with your nervous system and train yourself to support your output even when under duress. I truly hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Michael Allison. So I have the delight and pleasure to sit down with another Polyvagal Institute conference friend, Mr. Michael Allison. Welcome to the Unveil podcast.
Hi, so good to see you, Victoria.
I am really excited about today's conversation for so many reasons, mostly because your presentation at the Polyvagal Institute was so good that I was texting my mum throughout it, going, did you realize? Because my mum is a tennis fan. So she and I, we've had conversations about various tennis superstars over the years. And I'm like, why don't people like this guy and all that kind of stuff? And she really understood what you were saying in your presentation, which gives our audience a teaser. However, what I'd really love for us to do is start in my usual way, which is just sharing the 30,000-foot view of who you are with my podcast listeners, and more specifically, how it is that you serve.
Yeah, so I have owned a fitness and wellness training center for 23 years in Santa Barbara, California. And it was far more than just training people to move. And what I learned throughout my whole time was that really what I was getting at was helping people change really important habits, right? And those habits played a huge role in how they were experiencing their life. And what I first started doing was getting into habit change and behavior science and all of those sorts of things. But when it came to the really important, the really essential habits that were getting in the way of how they really wanted to experience the world and be who they really were, it wasn't about typical habit change and behavior science. That didn't work. It wasn't about making things just easy and obvious and rewarding and all of that. It wasn't that. It was far deeper. And that led me into discovering Rick Hansen. positive neuroplasticity. And so I reached out to Rick, oh gosh, 7 or 8 years ago. And I really dove deep into his work.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up mentoring with him. I went up to Spirit Rock, spent the day with him, had a private lunch, and really started talking about more and more in depth of all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually was who mentioned to me, he goes, Michael, he goes, you're just a really good synthesizer. And I was like, okay, what does that really mean? He goes, well, because at that point I knew his work inside and out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was really applying it in my facility and with my own clients. But he's like, I really think you're going to really like Porges's work. And I was like, Porges? Who's Porges? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was who first introduced me to polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
And when I first dove into that, it just made so much sense. It made so much sense of my own history and how I was adaptively and subconsciously responding to events that were pretty impactful and hurtful. And I also realized that I was sort of intuitively beginning to my own experiences where I had some shutting down responses in growing up. And then as I became a teenager, and I was also kind of a little skinny kid. And I remember I started dating this girl when I was a freshman in high school. And she grabbed my arm and she goes, I think my arm is more muscular than yours. Okay. So
Oh.
I was like, okay, so I was an athlete too, but I was just I was still skinny and I was kind of lanky.
Yeah.
And I started lifting weights, because of that comment. I'm like, well, I'm going to lift some weights. Of course, right? I'm a teenage boy.
Right.
So I started lifting weights, and that was the beginning of sort of no longer being more in a shutdown response. And I started mobilizing. And I unfortunately started then mobilizing with some anger and some resentment and some frustration. And it was all directed at my father. I don't need to get into the specifics of that, but that was really what it was. And it was a very unsettled home. And he would just erupt and react without any understanding or any signs that it might happen. So my response to that was to really be in a shutdown dorsal response. But as I started lifting weights, I started to mobilize. And I started to get angry, particularly at people who really cared about me, which is also interesting, right? So I was a really good baseball pitcher. And I got really angry at my coach because he didn't start me in a pivotal game. And that wasn't how I was. And I remember in the moment actually watching how I was behaving and being blown away. Like, who is this? What are you doing? You actually really like him. Right. And then I had a teacher. I was number one in my class. So I was valedictorian in my class. And I erupted on a teacher who I loved. And I was like, what is going on? So as I began to mobilize and I got angry, then fortunately for me, I met this girl. And she came from the family that I didn't have. She had this wonderfully supportive family and two brothers that one was my age and another one was a little bit older. And her mom and her dad, and they were just this cocoon of safety, this cocoon of trust. And it changed everything for me. And it contained that mobilized energy that was moving more into anger and resentment. And it contained it and it turned it into play and turned it into love and it turned it into what I do now. So that's sort of a long story of when I really started reading Dr. Porges's work. I could just sort of look back at my whole history and I could see how my body had adaptively responded to things that were beyond what I could handle. And then how my own body sort of intuitively found the path back and was remobilizing. And then it was really a lot of just luck, finding that girl and finding that family that contained that mobilized energy and turned it into love and play and what I'm teaching now, which is what I call the play zone. So that's sort of a long answer. The 30-foot view
The
of
30-foot
how I got to where what I do now.
Yeah. And I love all of this because within that story, you've shared these concepts that you and I walk within our daily life in terms of nervous system behavior and the adaptive response from the human vehicle to things. And this comes from Dr. Stephen Porges' Polyvagal Theory. And I'd love for you to just talk into that in any way that you'd like to just give our listeners a insight as to what Polyvagal Theory actually is.
Sure.
And a bit of your relationship with Dr. Stephen Porges as well, because I know that's developed over
Great.
time. So I'd really love to hear that side of the story.
Yeah. So what it is to me is it's simply a map. And it's a map that shows us how our body, just like mine did as a kid, how our body adaptively and subconsciously, reflexively reacts. And it's reacting to what's coming at us in the environment from other interactions with others and within our own body. But what's really cool is it's not only reacting to threat and risk and uncertainty and danger, which mine was to my father in our unsettled home, but it's also capable of reacting to safety, to love, to trust, right? And so that's what it is to me. It's just a map. And it's an understanding of how these reactions are reflexive. And they're happening whether or not we recognize it. But when we can begin to recognize it and we can stay on our own side without judgment or evaluation or a lot of shame and blame and guilt or having fault, when we can stay there, then it gives us an opportunity to kind of care for those bodily reactions. Just in a way that we can find enough safety and enough connection that we can come back into aligning our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors and our actions and our interactions in ways that really match who we are and our values and our goals and our intentions. So that's what it is to me. How I ended up really connecting with Dr. Porges and the whole Polyvagal Institute is I started really applying this work in my own language to a lot of clients. So I own this fitness and wellness center in Santa Barbara, and I do a lot of work one-on-one with all different ages and types of people, general population to competitive athletes. It's all over the board. And so I started sort of figuring out how can I really teach this in a way that's a little more subtle, right? And kind of incorporate into one-on-one sessions or group sessions. And through some of those folks that I was training, even though it wasn't like polyvagal training, it was movement and breath and all this, but it was all about them experiencing while learning the theory and my application of the theory. One of those clients had me coach one of his assistants who was best friends with the girlfriend of a professional tennis player. So through this thing. And so I kind of was training this client, and then I was training his assistant, and then I was coaching the girlfriend. And she was like, you got to meet my boyfriend. I'm like, well, who's your boyfriend? Blah, 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 blah. And so then I had to really, and that was a few years ago. So what I had to do then is really put it together in a more compact program, more concise methodology that he and other professional performers could understand without having to learn a whole new language. And so through that process, I worked with him for quite a while, and I would write everything out. And it turned into like a 150-page manuscript, which the day that Polyvagal Institute sort of announced they were opening, I immediately sent an email saying, here's who I am. Take a look at this. I'd be curious if you find this interesting. And they did. And so I jumped on a Zoom with Randall, who's the director, and who also happens to be a tennis player. And so it really was like, wow. And so then what I did is he asked me, he's like, look, let's get this into something that Dr. Porges will really read. He's
Yeah.
not going to sit down without knowing you and read 150 pages. And that essentially turned into a PowerPoint, which is one of my courses that I offer. So kind of shrunk it down, turned it into like a 150-page PowerPoint, still quite long, and gave it to Dr. Porges a couple of years ago, and now we're here. So now what I do is I have that basic course that introduces my application, what I call the play zone. And then I also coach coaches. So then I have a more in-depth 30-hour course that is actually certificating coaches as polyvagal-informed health, wellness, and performance coaches that I do through the Institute as well.
This is amazing. So I didn't know some of these details because like we just met and I didn't get the full kind of numbers.
Yeah.
I love that you coach coaches. Like I love, we connected over some functional medicine stuff, and there's a lot of links between the way we think about this stuff and being polyvagal informed as a health and wellness coach is rare. Actually, it's like, this is the bit that I find missing from functional medicine. It's the bit that I find missing from health coaching, because it's not enough to think the body is just the physicality. It has to be the nervous system, and therefore polyvagal theory. And so I adore that you do this. And I also just want to give a shout out to the Polyvagal Institute because they're so nervous system oriented as an organization. They are the kind of people who read an email and an 150-page manuscript and actually make space in their world for people who take the theory. And this is one thing that I absolutely adore about Dr. Porges. He isn't proprietary about his stuff. He has a theory, and what he's fascinated and delighted by is people who apply it in very many ways and through their different lenses.
Totally spot on. He is a living and breathing example, a role model of feeling safe enough that you can be accessible.
Yes.
And we saw that at the conference. That's what was amazing to me too. Not only has he been accessible to me, but watching how accessible he was to everyone at the conference was just, it was so admirable.
It was profound, and it took me a while to get over myself enough to go and approach him.
Yeah, I bet.
Because for me, his work saved my life. Like it's not small. And then you're like, he's literally sitting at the back of the conference room, and his son's here, and there's his wife's here, and I'm like, this feels like kind of like out of body experience. But he was genuinely there for everyone.
Yeah, and you could feel it. As you know, in my talk, I sort of acknowledged a little bit. You know, I had met him many times on Zoom. We had done several recordings together, sort of like what you and I are doing, and Q&As. And so I knew him, but to me, he's a huge mentor to me, and a very important, and someone I deeply respect and admire. And so here, as you know, I have taken his work, and what I spoke about was performance. So now I have to perform because I'm talking about his theory in performance, and I'm having to perform with him sitting right there.
Right.
Right. And that was really a big deal to me.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful.
And what I loved about it was
accessible.
Yeah, he was. And I loved because to me, it showed me how much it meant to you. The kind of like the presenting your work is always a bit daunting when it's actually the work of someone else that you've translated for your audience. But we care. Like I think in this industry, we care, especially about respecting Dr. Porges. And I think that's rare. I really think that's quite unique.
And I think that's because of who he is.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, totally. I want, and that's why I approached them in the first place is, look, I want to make sure that what I'm doing is actually fully in alignment.
Right.
Really.
Right. Yeah. Well,
I don't want to be making stuff up. I want to make sure it's aligning with the science, with the physiology, with what's really going on.
Yeah. Which is a great segue into just highlighting on some of the stuff that I want to touch on some of the storylines that you talked about in your presentation, because I thought they were fascinating and really, really understandable from the lens of someone who doesn't need to really understand the whole mechanisms of polyvagal systems. So I'd really love for you to almost give the overview of the route through some of your talk that you gave that day, and kind of what you were seeing in these professional tennis players in your examples,
Great.
and how
Yeah.
you were encoding this understanding of polyvagal theory into the behavior that we witness, because everything's
Great.
televised these days. And I'd love for you to just
Yeah.
take it away and share these stories.
Yeah. There's so many places to go. But like first, what we see in most performers, um, especially in professional sports, is we see, and it's the same thing that we'll see with walking into the classroom or walking up on stage, is we see the body mobilizing and getting really unsettled, heart rate raising, blood pressure going up, sweating, breathing gets quicker. We see all of this mobilized energy. And typically it's scattered and it's unsettled, and we label it anxiety. We're really, really anxious. And then what the quote successful performers or athletes tend to do, or even in business, they tend to channel that and turn it into aggression and attack and fighting and ultimately trying to dominate.
Yeah.
And it really is, and we hear it all the time. It really is, it's a war zone. It's a battle. It's a fight. Okay. That's the typical. And that's what almost every person I talk to, that's what they're after. I want to be a warrior. So even this first player that I worked with, that was a professional, and he was top 100 in the world at the time. His whole thing is, I want to be, there's a book out by Michael Jordan's trainer, and it's all about being the cleaner. And the cleaner is this, doesn't matter if anyone else is with you, anyone else on your team, you're just going out to clean up. And that's what he really wanted to be. So I had to be very, very careful in not destroying that image, but changing what you're really after.
Right.
That isn't ultimately what we're really after. But that's the way I created what I call the performance hierarchy. And if you're in that highly mobilized but very unsettled and quote anxious zone, that's what I call the flight zone. And that is more reactive and just defending and hoping things go your way, or hoping, if you're playing a competitor, hoping they make a mistake. So when you channel that towards aggression, towards offense, towards attacking, to me, that is higher up the performance hierarchy, because you're doing something with intention.
Got it.
Now, the negatives to that, aside from it not feeling great, aside from it sort of not really being a lot of fun, is metabolically, it's highly, highly costly. It's not efficient. You're actually, because it's still grounded in some threat, fear, you're actually not tapping into the higher levels of your brain that show you what might be possible. There might be a different solution. So you might get locked in on a strategy that isn't working, but you get locked in on it, right? So it minimizes your ability to actually see the whole picture, to be creative, to be resourceful. And if it doesn't work, you're really close to your threshold for what you can handle, which, as we know from polyvagal theory, if we can't overcome the challenge and there isn't any more resource left, we will begin a trajectory towards shutting down. And we see it play out all of the time. So you can continue on that path of being a warrior, or what I was proposing as an alternative. How do you just channel, how do you take that mobilized energy, because that's all that it is, and how do you contain it with enough safety, enough self-care, enough ventral vagal control, because that's really what it is, and turn it into play, which is exactly what that family and that girl and her brothers and her mom and dad, that's what they did to me. They took my mobilized energy, which I was turning into aggression, and they contained it with love and trust and co-regulation,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it became play.
Mm.
And that's what I want to do. That's essentially what athletes and any performers can do.
Mm.
So I told a couple of specific stories.
Mm.
One is Naomi Osaka, who most
Yeah.
people who can, even outside of the world of tennis, can connect with.
Mm.
And I have a real soft spot for her because she, in 2018, she had this experience on the court playing her idol, Serena Williams, in the finals of her Grand Slam.
Mm.
And Serena had these altercations with the referee, and the referee, he went into his fight zone.
Right.
And the only thing he could do in that, without thinking clearly, was keep penalizing her until he penalized her the third time, which gave Osaka a game. That's the rules. It wasn't that Osaka did anything, but the crowd felt gypped. The crowd, who was really rooting for Serena, not against Osaka, but they wanted Serena, they erupted and they go nuts. And poor Naomi Osaka, her body subconsciously took that in as she was to blame,
Mm.
as she was at fault for
Mm-hmm.
creating this whole situation.
Mm.
And what we've seen ever since is we've seen her not ever fully come back to safety,
Yeah.
not ever really find her own sense of peace and ease and actually belonging
Mm.
again.
It's so, I mean, I got really moved by that story, and as you shared it in your talk, and you were sharing visuals as well. There were like photographs and stills of the matches, and stills of the press conference afterwards, or the award ceremony, or something like that. And it was
Mhm.
so obvious once you pointed it out, of this kind of
Yes.
shame cycle response.
Yes.
And I think that's the bit that I really get fascinated about within polyvagal theory and any kind of nervous system coaching work, is this shame that freezes everything. And it freezes the wrong word when we're talking about polyvagal theory, but it just sticks everything. It kind of stagnates in this immobility or whatever it is that is creating some kind of blockage. And it's
Yeah.
so devastating, because even all, and I don't want to say this, and I would love to hear what you would do with your clients in this scenario, but it seems to me like even all of the languaging in the world to Naomi, like, you didn't do anything wrong, this is not your fault, like, it wasn't you, this was the ref. I'm sure none of that has like helped or gone in. And I'm interested to
Yeah.
understand what you would do with clients in this dynamic, where how do we move people beyond the shame spiral, beyond the freeze, beyond the shutdown, into mobilizing, into,
Yeah.
success.
That's a great question. And so I think it is both. So
Mm.
the letting her know cognitively that how this all works, why her body did what it did, is
Right.
helpful.
Yes.
It's helpful, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
It's just like removing the threat or removing ourselves from the threat
Mm.
isn't necessarily enough. We need to also find the portals that we recognize as safe and
Mhm.
connecting
Mhm.
to help retune the body back to trust,
Mhm.
back to safety. And so I would do a little bit of that with her.
Mm.
So I would do more experientials. I would do more body stuff.
Yeah.
I would actually, so I look at it as parallel pathways.
Mhm.
You can teach and cognate what is actually going on.
Mhm.
You've got to get the felt sense in the body,
Yeah.
however that is. And I don't know what that would be for her, but
Mhm.
that's what I would explore.
Mhm.
Is are there certain people that she absolutely does trust?
Right.
And let's make sure we spend some time with them,
Right.
right?
Right.
Are there certain things that you do that actually you do in that experience feel a sense of ease, a sense of comfort?
Mm.
And does it then trigger a secondary response after that? That's not
Mhm.
like, but can we
Yeah.
find those things, whether it's breathing, whether it's moving,
Yeah.
whether it's walking in nature, whether it's sitting under a tree? But I tend to I call it building the safety of habit,
Mhm.
right? Or the habit of safety, sorry,
Mhm.
safety of habit,
I
building
mean,
the habit of safety.
yeah.
And so in my own life and with my own clients,
Yeah.
in any environment that I am, I want to find those things
Mm.
or those faces
Mhm.
or listen to those voices or listen to those birds,
Mm.
right? So I'm trying at all times when
Mm.
I orient to a new environment,
Mm.
what are those cues that are available
Mm.
that reassure my body. So
Mm-hmm.
I would sort of build that, right? And sometimes that's what a practice is.
Yeah.
A practice could be where you put yourself in that space,
Mm.
or you internally create a breathing pattern that supports that space in your body,
Mm-hmm.
or you put your attention toward the features around you that, again, help bring you into that
Mm-hmm.
space. And if as it's likely that as she does feel at ease,
Mm.
that then will trigger a sense of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And then she'll probably mobilize,
Mm.
right? So then that comes back into that whole titration piece. So you have to do it very carefully
Mm-hmm.
and for a short duration.
Mm.
And then that's the chance to re-narrate. So, oh, now I'm mobilizing again. Okay, let's
Mm.
just label that mobilizing again,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
right? Let's not get into the elaborate
Yeah, the sciencey. Yeah,
narrative,
yeah.
right? And so that's what works for me,
Mm.
is focus more on, and even with habit change,
Mm-hmm.
like where we started with all of this,
Mm.
I don't go after the really big
The
habits
habit.
that are,
Yeah.
I don't go after those. I do it in an indirect way. I
Mm.
keep building more of these habits of safety,
Mm-hmm.
which they're doing two things.
Mm.
One, what they're doing is they're actually shifting the physiology
Yeah.
to be more comfortable with actually being comfortable, right?
Yeah.
So they're actually shifting the physiology back into homeostasis, back
Mm.
into a physiology that's supporting health, growth, restoration, and
Mm-hmm.
relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Porges' wife, Sue, who's also a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
who is awesome,
Awesome.
and she has that word sociostasis,
Yes.
right? So that's what you're essentially doing through this habit of safety, is you're
Mm.
you're actually helping the body find and feel and be okay with letting the guard down,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
then what you're also doing is you're building resources
Mm.
and strategies. So
Mm-hmm.
when you do go after the bigger habit that's
Mm-hmm.
harder
Mm-hmm.
and you're trying to interrupt it,
Mm-hmm.
you have some skills and strategies that you've already built that can help you when you get even more flooded because you're interrupting the
Mm-hmm.
habit,
Mm. I
right?
think
But you're at a baseline already that's more grounded in
right.
homeostasis.
Right. And I think for me, there's an element of this as well. When you're adding in different kind of resources, when you're adding in resources that give you the safety, the socio safety, whatever it is, um, you are not adding shame. This is not, this habit over
No,
here is a problem.
no,
It's, let's get you this stuff over here that's helpful.
totally,
And it
totally.
totally
Yeah,
recalibrates the nervous system.
totally, totally. So I can share. So in my own life, right,
Mm.
what we were talking about as a kid, in addition to all of that was going on for me, and really being unsafe
Yeah.
in an unsafe environment, we were a fundamental Christian household.
Mm. Oh, wow.
So now I'm having tremendous guilt
Mm-hmm.
and shame
Mm.
for wishing bad thoughts about those who were inflicting. So throw that in there too,
Yeah.
like tremendous shame and guilt.
Yeah.
I never, in my process of
Mm.
healing,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even go directly at the shame.
Mm.
I just kept finding more and more safety.
Yeah.
I don't have shame. I
Right.
get it. It's like, oh, I totally
Yes.
get it.
Yes, and
Right.
that this is what
So,
the explanation does to people. It's like if you explain some of the science behind what's actually happening,
yeah,
you kind of don't have shame because it becomes this totally biologically appropriate response from your organism
absolutely.
that just did a
Absolutely.
thing.
And I don't have shame for the way he behaved or any of that. Like, it's
Right.
like, or blame. It's like, oh, but again, you have to get it both ways.
Yeah.
The cognitive,
Cognitive.
but in the body,
Yeah. And I think
right?
the interesting
And
thing for me as well is some of this, and it just came to me when you were speaking about getting the movement back into the body and mobilizing energies. It just struck me about athletes. And actually musicians, anybody who does this kind of performance, it's like their art is usually their nervous system regulation practice as well. It's how they get
totally,
to flow state. So when
totally.
something interrupts their ability to do that with kind of relaxation, it's almost like it's a double whammy. They can't do their flow state activity, so they have to find that stuff elsewhere.
Yeah, totally. Did you ever watch the Frank Sinatra documentary?
I didn't know.
That's a really good one to watch too,
Hmm.
because you'll see that when you're talking about their actual performance or their stage
Hmm.
becomes their safe zone. It
Yeah.
becomes, and the activity is really play
Yeah.
because it's their safe zone with some mobilized energy. So Frank Sinatra was a great example of that.
Hmm.
When you
Hmm.
watch that documentary from this lens, you'll see how unsettled and scattered and unsafe he
Yeah.
is, except the moment he
Yeah.
walks on stage.
Yeah.
The moment he starts to actually sing
Yeah.
with he had super long exhales. He
Yeah.
had the ability to carry a
Of
note
course.
longer than
Yeah.
anyone.
Yeah.
And so now he's vaguely regulating his
Yeah.
heart, slowing it down.
Yeah.
He's engaging, he's listening to himself too. So
Yeah.
he's using the middle ear muscles.
Yeah.
And then he's seeing the faces of everyone
Yeah.
just
Like
aligned with him.
adoring.
It
Yeah.
was the healthiest he ever was,
And
right?
this is so true, and I don't even think about this. I'm a singer, I'm a musician, and so
Yeah.
I've always known that when you're singing, you're actually activating the vagus nerve just because of the way the larynx and everything works. But
Yes.
I
Yeah.
hadn't tied in the long exhale. So
Oh, and
what
the
Michael
long
means, yeah.
exhale.
So when you're
Yeah.
exhaling, everyone who listened to my podcast with Jack Ginsberg will know this because he's the HRV researcher. But the exhales activate parasympathetic mode, and so you're kind of very much relaxing. And
There.
I've always had this phrase, music is medicine. And like it just is like there's just so much that can be
No, it
said for
totally is.
singing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so much is. And what you're also doing, which is really, really cool,
Hmm.
is you are still mobilizing. So
Mm.
you're building resilience. So
Yeah.
not only is it feeding that sense of safety,
Yeah.
which can help with your homeostasis, but you're deliberately engaging and then listening,
Yeah.
engaging, right? So you're giving and receiving.
Yeah.
And so it becomes what Dr. Porges would call a neural exercise. It's a
Right.
neural exercise for the vagal regulation of your physiology. That's what it is.
We should
Through
just
the use of
yeah.
all the
That
muscles in your
too.
face, your larynx and thorax, and your middle ear. And that is a really important point too. Like we know that social connection and social support is really, really healthy. But what is it really? Well,
Mhm.
what it is from the polyvagal theory's understanding and the neuroanatomy
Mm.
is it has to be reciprocal too,
Mm, mhm, mm,
right? It's the reciprocal synchronicity of it
mm.
because it's using the larynx and the pharynx, it's using the middle ear and the facial expressions and the gestures, and then receiving that back that's changing, that becomes that neural exercise,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're engaged, like if Frank Sinatra was up there singing,
Yeah.
doing what he does,
Yeah.
and everyone in the audience was flat faced,
Mhm.
arms crossed,
Mhm.
whatever,
Mhm.
he would still get some benefit because he's using his own vagal regulation, but
Yeah.
he's not receiving.
It's
It
that,
wouldn't be
yeah.
nearly as helpful to his own physiology.
Yeah. And I think this is the thing that we forget sometimes. It's the being with another human that is a part of the magic of some of these things, a part of the magic of the healing,
Yes.
a part of the magic of
Yes.
what we do as
Yes.
coaches. Like a big part of it isn't the
Big.
exercise or the
Mhm.
practice. It's
Mhm.
just being with.
Yes, but the being with means that we have connected.
Yeah.
And what connection really is that it's that reciprocal exchange. And that is the co-regulation piece, is when our physiologies
Mhm.
are actually moving.
Mm,
They're
mhm.
going up together, they're going down together. Sometimes they might be a little bit interrupted, but they come back.
Yes.
And through that, we build more and more trust because we
Yeah.
trust that
Yes.
we can even interrupt it. And
Yeah.
then we come back.
I think I really just want to double click on that for our listeners because people forget this all the time. It's not that everything has to be sunshine and rainbows and we're always accurately, effectively meeting and co regulating with the other person. This is a bad thing to say, but I'm almost a really big fan of rupture because then you can repair. And I'm like,
Totally.
the repair is the magic
Totally.
because then you build more trust
Oh,
over time.
totally. Totally. And we
Yeah.
see that play out. I mean, I just wrote this piece um and to Porges, and I'm probably gonna put it in Psychology Today. And
Mm,
it's the idea that actually empathy to compassion is a two-step process
mm,
physiologically. So think of your own personal experiences, especially with people that you deeply care for. If you see them hurting and suffering in any type of pain, you hurt. So that's empathy, right?
Yeah.
You have this, and if we were monitoring your heart and your vagal regulation of your heart, we'd see it change,
Yeah.
right? If we were seeing your breathing, we'd see it change. We would absolutely see that you are entering, quote, a threat physiology. You're having a bodily reaction to align with them. But if you stayed in that place, you're not really able to help the other. You're no longer a safe witness. You're actually a triggered witness. And you're going to want to either correct or fix, right? End the suffering. Partly because it's your suffering.
Impacting you, yes.
Right, exactly. So that's the empathy. The compassion is where you actually have come back into enough ventral vagal control that you're actually back in enough sense of safety that you can be a non-evaluative, safe, present witness.
Yeah.
You're not trying to fix them or you because you've already come back. And that's actually not just intention.
No.
That's in your physiology. That is actually vagal efficiency. That's that ability for yourself to have a reaction, to lose some vagal control, heart rate goes up, but then come back, right? So that's what's essentially happening in a co-regulatory space where you're talking about with a rupture. So the rupture would be that if you looked away, I might all of a sudden have a quick spike in my heart rate. I might mobilize, or I might shut down, either way. But having good vagal efficiency, which is really what's going on beneath the surface, I can come back and be present for our reconnection and vice versa, right? That's really what's going on. But that's really empathy to compassion.
Right. And I feel like this is a really good, because there's a lot of words bandied around now about attachment styles and stuff like that. And codependency comes up a lot. And when I see codependency, I really don't like the word, because I feel like it denies the fact that we really do need to co-regulate with people. We actually do need other humans. So we kind of do have a dependency. But what I think you're pointing really nicely to is the difference between over-reliance on manipulating the nervous system of someone else so you can feel better, and losing connection with yourself. And I think that's the difference. It's like co-regulating by being self-regulated is healthy.
Yeah, I haven't thought of the codependency piece from this angle, but yeah, to me, codependency would be that we both get locked into an empathic state.
Right.
We both get locked into some threat physiology.
Yeah.
And the only way out, and it may not even be an out, is to do it together.
Right.
But we end up wallowing in that threat physiology.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it was sometimes when there's one codependent party in the dynamic and the other one isn't, the codependent one feels like the kind of unsafe one. But when I look at that, it's always like, well, what is happening from the one that isn't codependent to create this dynamic? And I get into this sense, are we all wandering around with threat physiology? And to be honest, I think we are. I think not from the perspective of oscillating very well, not the regulation, but as in the ability to regulate, but that kind of like, we're all just a little bit hypervigilant at times, I think, anyway.
I don't disagree. And that's partly the culture, right? That's partly, it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Because there is a lot of threat. Like I'm coaching this law. I work with a lot of attorneys, but I'm working with this, a law clerk who's trying to pass the bar. But before even going there, I really wanted her to acknowledge that the environment she's working in that law firm, it's a pretty revved up, unsafe environment, because it is. It really is. From the nervous system standpoint, the people around it. So we were sitting in a coffee shop when we met this last time, and I just had her look around the coffee shop, because most of the people in the coffee shop were not in communication with one another. They were on their computers. Right. And when they're on their computers, they're like, and I'm like, that's just a snippet of what she's surrounded by in the office. And let's just really feel how that feels. So I think you're right. And that, and that all the way to where we started, that is the world of performance. Like when these athletes come onto their stage, it's highly likely the opponent on the other side is out to fight.
Right.
They absolutely are.
Right.
So the point is not to ignore that and say, oh no, this is just play. No, you have to first acknowledge that they are a threat. They absolutely are a threat. And your body is going to react to that. Whether you believe it is or not, it is. So let's actually acknowledge that. Let's let's meet your body where it is in response to that. And now see if there's something we can do about it. That was one of our most early on in this pro player. He was playing this guy who just comes out and tries to just throttle you off the court in the warm-up.
Yeah. Oh,
totally.
In the warm-up.
In the warm-up.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, it starts even before the warm-up. It starts by they show up late. So like it's all time, but when you're a top player, you can fudge the system a little bit and you can make everybody wait for you. And so he does that. That's the beginning of the whole thing. You're waiting for me. I'm the dominant one. And then from the very first ball in warm-up, it's just all out. I'm going to exude this. And you have to know that is impacting you. You can't just pretend it doesn't. So that's a really important part. And that's what I was getting at with this attorney.
Right.
You have to know this is impacting you. So it's really important that you really become focused on what you can do at work, outside of work, to speak the language of safety and connection that your body needs, because you need more. I'm not in that environment. I'm actually not in that environment.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
It's so funny. I've got an attorney client at the moment, and it's a lot of this. It's a lot of your environment is completely sending you down this track, and they're going into a good deal of shame and a good deal of why can't I get this, and a good deal of, and it's like no, you physiologically are doing the right thing. Like in that environment, in those four walls, when you're at work, this is the correct biologically adaptive approach from your nervous system. So let's forget about feeling like there's anything we can physically do to counter it, but let's, to your point, create a different sense of resilience so that it is less impactful, it's less noticeable, it triggers less stress, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, totally. And that can be in all different ways. That can be doing alternating, that can be like a Wim Hof breathing style.
Right.
Deliberately outside of there, where you're training your physiology, how to go ramped up and calm and ramped up and even a little bit of shutting down.
Yeah.
But that's no longer associated with now I'm losing control.
Yeah.
Right?
We do sauna, cold plunge, cold exposure therapy here, and we do the alternating. And it's
Perfect.
like
Same kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's it, right? And like, because if you get to the physiology, it's a very similar physiology that you are experiencing in a very stressful interaction.
Right. And so what we're saying here for our listeners is that your physiology becomes used to it in a safe situation, essentially. So when you're then in the unsafe situation, the threatening situation, it isn't as destabilizing. You have more bandwidth to cope with that physiological shift.
Yeah, those feelings in your body are familiar.
Yeah.
They're not unfamiliar anymore. They aren't as massive a trigger of threat. Right? And so then you also learn how to relate to how your bodily changes are occurring differently. So instead of all of a sudden my heart rate racing and me now attaching a story of like, oh no, this means, holy cow, I'm going to completely flub this. All that it means is, oh my gosh, my heart rate's racing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. For whatever reason, I am mobilizing for whatever reason. It doesn't even matter. So it changes how we relate to those shifts that are reflexively occurring.
Right.
And then in addition to that, it's not as massive of a trigger.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, we actually can have strategies and resources and places to put our attention to help ourselves.
And I always say to my clients, like, it's not about doing this stuff in the moment of stress, because like trying to have, so let me step back a bit. That like sometimes we do need to have curiosity about like, why did my heart rate race in that moment, but not in the moment that it's actually racing. At that moment, it's just, let's
Yes.
just be with the physical experience, and you can do post-game analysis on it later. Like we don't need to have this kind of, let's try and fix the problem whilst we're in the dysregulated state.
Yes, you're tapping on a really good point. Like that isn't, eventually you can get to that place. Eventually.
Yeah.
But that's not where you start. And even you said one other thing that is really important is it's not even about fixing it. It's literally about, and I talk about that a little bit. Even the greatest champions have those bodily reactions. They might not be as massive,
Right.
and they might not be to the same situation that triggers you. It might take more uncertainty, it might take more danger, risk, more might have to be on the line, but they're still having them. It's how they're relating to those bodily changes, and it's them, what are they doing with those changes? How are they actually caring for their body in those situations, in those experiences? And that's everything.
Yes.
Right?
And
if they do quote fail, whatever you want to call failure, if they don't, if their execution doesn't match their potential, doesn't match their skill set, doesn't match their intention, instead of shaming and blaming and feeling like they just aren't good enough, that doesn't have to occur anymore when you understand the physiology and how the body's just reflexively reacting. So it takes away that, how you relate to yourself when you quote come up short.
Right. And sometimes I would love for some of these theories to be simpler, because we can't delineate the power of some of them because they're so multifactorial. Because when you have the explanation, you remove the shame. When you remove the shame, anything is possible. But we've also got tools to metabolize and mobilize and all the things. And it's like, this is just an everything system. And the way you're using it, the way I use this sort of stuff, it's like, I sometimes feel like a magician, and I just get to give the clients radical permission to be them, and radical permission to do things that on the surface people and they judge without them having this second thoughts, third thoughts, nights awake sleeping, wondering what they did.
Totally. Yeah. And part of it too, in line with what you're talking about, is everybody wants something to do. And I think that's okay. That's kind of where it starts. It's sort of like you start with doing different things or interrupting different patterns and doing something else. And that's kind of where it starts. But it may not have to either, because ultimately it becomes being. It becomes more about being with, right? And not putting too many narratives to the being with.
Right.
Aside from what the actual bodily feeling feels like, or aside, like, right? And because part of this that can get a little bit tricky is if you give someone all of these different resources and all of these different strategies and all this, then it can come simply a way of not ever being with. Right? There's a nuance there.
There is a nuance.
There's a nuance. It's not about avoiding. It's not about having all of these controlling resources and containing everything such that you're just this steady Eddie who's where you mentioned it before in the relationship where it's not just bliss. It's not at all what we're after. I absolutely blow it. Totally. Just blew it the other night with my daughter. And yet how I related to blowing it was completely different than it would have been 10 years ago. Right. And then that enabled me to actually get out of empathy for her, and then even empathy for myself for blowing it. And I actually was able to enter compassion.
Yes.
And approach her from a completely different place of actual safety that she immediately subconsciously picked up on and didn't pull away, didn't fight against, didn't pull away, and was able to actually just receive her dad acknowledging he blew it.
Yeah.
Totally different experience.
Yes. And I really love the distinction you're making between empathy and compassion, because that apology can come from, oh my God, I need to fix the problem. And it
Yes.
feels
That's
inauthentic.
empathy.
Right.
Yeah, for
Whereas
yourself.
yes. But it can also come
Yeah.
from, wow, I need to own this. I need to
Yeah,
take ownership of this thing that I did. Um,
totally.
yeah, I feel like
Without, yeah, without guilt either by that point too, right? Like by
right.
that point, and it some for some of us that might take a week, might take 5 minutes, it might take, right? But as our physiology becomes more and more grounded in homeostasis
Mm-hmm,
and has the capacity to lose it and regain control,
mm-hmm,
we become more efficient at coming back into compassion,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? For ourselves. And that's where I think when we say too that we need to have self-compassion before we can give compassion,
mm-hmm,
what that really means in my language is we need to come back into a physiological state of safety
mm-hmm.
before we can give compassion to another,
Right.
right? So self-compassion, again, physiologically just means I'm back with vagal regulation, I'm
Yeah.
back in homeostasis, I'm enough that now I'm not in pain,
Mm-hmm,
I'm not suffering.
mm-hmm.
Because an initial response, like I want to apologize to her because I feel so bad for not being the way I really wanted to be with her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's really, I'm trying to, again, I want to help her, but I also want to help me feel better in
Yeah.
that first moment.
Right.
That isn't compassion.
No.
Mm-mm.
Every time I think about this and I have people like you help me delineate some of these things out, I become really aware of time and how much time we sometimes don't give ourselves and how much time we need. And I feel like sometimes we're firefighting with this stuff. It's like, oh my God, instant repair, instant fix, instant resolve the problem, instant push forwards. And none of that works because we're always trying to do it from the very state that got triggered. And even if we step
Yes.
out of trigger to fix, doing it from that
Oh, you're still,
empathy
yeah,
place,
yeah,
it's
you're
like,
still
I'm really,
mobilized.
yeah, you're
Yeah,
still,
yeah.
and I feel like there's this, if we could all, and it's not just about taking a deep breath, although the reason people say take a deep breath is because of the parasympathetic nervous system thing.
Exactly.
It does feel like if we could take a deep breath and actually go, how do I get back to
Yeah,
self compassion, then move forwards, we'd all be in a better world.
we would be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't easy and
Mm-hmm.
it isn't quick,
Mm.
right? And it's something we have to really commit to, just being with that. And it is a long process,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And it sometimes we blow it big time,
Mm.
right? Even though like for me, this is what I do. This is like the work that I am sharing go all the way back to how am I serving?
Mm.
How I am serving is how I'm living.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet I blow it all the time,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
right?
yeah, and I think it's really, and I will share too, like I'm in a place of incredible change and flux in my life. And I have been probably since we met, actually. It's been legitimate chaos. And I have been battling to get re regulated. And I have blown it so many times in the last 2 months. And also, then secondary blown it by not taking responsibility. I've done all of these things, but
Mhm.
I am kind of coming to the point internally, actually, where there's a bit of breathing space coming into my life, and I'm really having that kind of compassion for, oh, I can see exactly what in me has been being triggered and what in me has been destabilized, and how little opportunity I've had to come back to center for
Great.
so many reasons. And I'm like, I can now actually go and make the right apologies, make the right kind of amends, because I've come at it from self compassion first,
Mm,
not from, oh no, I need to make amends and fix the problem because otherwise I will be out of a job or out of a home
right.
or whatever it
Yeah.
is. And
Yeah.
it feels different, but and I really want my listeners to hear this. It has taken me 2 months. It really has
Takes
to
time.
go
Really.
through
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
stuff.
Really
And
good.
I've been in this for 20 years. So like, and there are still moments where life is sufficiently unsafe that my nervous system is going to do all of the things that it's going to do. And then behaviorally on the surface, I'm going to do all of the things that I then do. And that's just life.
Yes.
Mm.
And it takes time,
It
like
does.
you said, right?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing because it's another really important piece of information
Mm-hmm.
is when we realize that there just doesn't feel like there's enough time, that's just an indication that we're still in threat.
Yes. Yes.
Because when we're actually in that safe, grounded, connected place where we feel like we belong here, time slows up.
Right. Yeah.
It does. And it happens when we're performing, and it happens when we're interacting. It happens that. So when we feel like we have to get something done or we have to repair, that's just information saying it's not actually ready. I'm not actually ready yet.
Yeah. That's a great thing for people to remember. The moment that we feel like we need to rush to repair, we're not
ready.
We're not there yet.
We're not ready. For whatever reason, we need to take, as you're saying, we need to take more time. Yeah, to be with. Yeah, that's.
I love that.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So, as speaking of time, as we are approaching the end of ours together, I would really love for you to just share a little bit about who you work with now. Like you mentioned, coaching coaches, that program is still open. Just share like what's available. How can people find you? And we'll put all in the show notes.
So the coaching program for health and wellness and performance coaches, the next cohort starts in early February. However, you can sign up for that. It's on the PVI website. You can sign up for that at any time. There's about 30 hours of material in there. And then we essentially meet every 2 weeks as a live group. And there are also, what's really been great about the program. So there have been about 80 coaches of all different types all over the world, from executive coaches to vocal coaches to somatic practitioners to sports psychologists to all different types of coaches, life coaches, health coaches. And there's about 25 of them that are now coach mentors for those coming into the group. So we're building this really cool, really engaged community. And a lot of those coaches sit in too on the live training sessions. And I often interview different coaches, kind of like what we're doing. And we talk about how they're applying what they've learned in the course to their discipline, whatever their craft is. And then from that, I just keep framing the core principles through those discussions. And so it's a very interactive learning, while also there is modules that you follow on your own. So that's going on. And like I said, they can join that anytime. And it's really for any type of coaching. Or there have been some people who aren't coaches. They just take it. And then I actually, and we're just in the early stages, we're going to be building an on-the-ground Polyvagal training center of some kind here in Santa Barbara. So we'll be doing some trainings and different things here and retreats and workshops and all of that. So that'll be coming also in 2023.
How exciting.
So we'll make some announcement for that. But yeah, there will be some on the ground Polyvagal center of some kind.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm really excited by that. Ooh.
Yeah. So we'll have a place and it's in Santa Barbara. So really pretty. And we'll have a place
get to come out to the sunshine and the
and we'll get to get together. So that's kind of the dream is there are a number of coaches all over the world, like I said, and a great place to come and do some, like we did in Atlantic Beach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a very magical 4 days. It really was.
Totally. So. Yeah. So we'll do similar things, but kind of more experientials.
Love
where
that.
we'll really be experiencing it in different ways, from music to movement to breath to whatever, right? To drum circles to that's the vision. Is more of an actual movement, experiential based teaching of the theory and embodying it.
This is so exciting.
That's coming.
Great. Well, and we will tag all of where people can find you and the training in the show
Great.
notes.
Awesome.
And I really enjoyed spending time with you, Paul. Paul, I've just called you Paul because Paul
That's
North
because
has
he's
just
my
come
good
out.
friend.
He's
That's
good friend.
because, and he's my good friend.
And I literally was in my head going, which podcast should I put out first? Should we do
He's gonna
Paul's and
love.
then Michael's? Because I think
He's gonna love that you called me Paul. I love that. That's a
I
compliment.
was genuinely thinking about which order to put you in, and I feel like I need to tag team you. Is kind of what where my podcaster brain was going.
So he's so cool. So I'll share. It was really funny. So I get an email from Steve from Dr. Porges,
Mm-hmm.
and it says, "Hey, I really want you to meet this guy, Paul, because Steve took a trip over to Australia,
Mm-hmm.
and that was his first trip this year,
Mm-hmm.
and he meets Paul, and he goes, I really want you to meet this guy." So I get on a Zoom with Paul, and then he ends up showing up at the Polyvagal Institute gathering, and we connected,
it up, yeah.
and we went out and we hit some tennis balls.
Oh, did you?
And he hadn't hit in years, and he was a player in his day.
Oh,
wow. Yeah, he was a legit player.
Great.
And he doesn't talk about it, but he hadn't hit in a long time, but now he's hitting now. Since we hit, he's hitting once a week. And
your magic has spread.
No, it's just so good. It was such a great introduction from Dr. Porges, and that if he introduces you to somebody, you're gonna, and that's how Paul was thinking the same thing. Paul's like, if he's saying I got to meet you, we got to meet. And so we spent one whole day together before the conference sort of started.
Cool.
Yeah, and we've become good buddies, and he's a great guy. So I admire that you. I really cute, actually.
And I really love that I'm going to stack you guys together in this podcast kind of series, because I feel like the more people understand about this from different lenses and different perspectives, and this has been a very different conversation, the better people will be able to use their own nervous systems, basically.
Totally. So, yeah. I mean, that's the point. It's applicable to anyone or anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And that's sort of the message to the coaches too, is it doesn't matter what your discipline is.
Right.
In the end, you're trying to really help whoever you're coaching.
Yeah.
How do they find safety and comfort in their body? Mm. And then how do you deliberately sort of challenge them so that they build resilience within a context of safety with you? But that's what we're doing, because it's not all, like we said, it's not all just sitting in bliss. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The world has challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Performing has challenge, right? Health has challenge. Relationships have challenge. So underneath all that is a resilient body, a resilient nervous system. Mm.
Thank you so much for sharing your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have loved every second of that. And I hope to see you soon in Santa Barbara at a Polyvagal Center. But until then, take care of yourself, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with the Unveiled podcast audience.
You're welcome. It's been a delight. Thank you.
This is why I love Polyvagal Institute people. Every time I speak to someone who is involved with polyvagal theory and understands the way the nervous system truly works, I find there is a different quality of conversation, as I hope that you have gathered now from both Paul North last episode and Michael Allison today. All of the links you need for the impressive level of things that Michael is doing are in our show notes, and I really hope that you check them out. Find him wherever you can find him. If you're in the UK, please try and get to one of these conferences mentioned. They are linked in the show notes. And if you are in the US and in Santa Barbara, you are incredibly lucky. And if you have any interest in what we've discussed today, then be on the lookout for when his performance and wellness facility is launched. Thank you once again for listening to the Unveiled podcast. One more episode of Polyvagal-Informed and Polyvagal Institute people is coming up next week, and I hope that you stay tuned.